It looks like Kelly is in the attendees room. Kelly Sally, if you can move her over. Perfect. All right. Welcome, everybody. So it's good to see everyone. I think we're all trying to get our second wind for what will hopefully be the home stretch for the task force. So I appreciate everybody joining in, and hopefully we'll move through these last several meetings. That this is officially our extension, starting this meeting. So I want to just drop in the chat. Task force members got an email with this this document as well, but this is the deck for tonight, and it has a fair bit of content that might just be helpful to be able to look at ongoing. So I wanted to make sure people have that as well, so you can refer to it as is useful. All right. We've got a couple of attendees. I think the last meeting was the hot one to attend because we were finalizing that first report. And we have just a couple of folks joining us this evening, but welcome. All right. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we are gonna pick up where we left off last time. I want to just first once again remind folks who are attending, who may not be aware, that our first round report, which had a January 15th deadline, was submitted on the 14th. So we handed in a day early, and so that is now available to both the mayor's office and to the council, and I'm sure we will hear thoughts on that from them ongoing. But again, thank you to all of task force members for the work on getting that to a really strong place, I think. And we are now going to see if we can move forward on the remaining items that that we sort of punted on in the first report, and to make sure we give them ample time beyond that January 15th deadline. So tonight we're going to spend some time continuing the conversation we started last week about factoring experience into the salary scale. And then we'll also spend a little time following up on conversation that, again, we started last time, which is thinking a little bit about priority data collection. So we've talked a lot about how we want to use the sort of beginning months of this work to, among other things, gather some additional data that will help inform the longer term work. So wanted to just spend just a moment on that this evening. All right, so this is just a review of the outstanding topics that we are going to be, can you all see this? Yeah, okay. That we are going to be looking at for this second report. So in addition to the piece about factoring in experience to the salary scale, because we've already looked at role and credential, but we have not looked at experience, we're going to move to looking a little bit more deeply at the long-term mechanism. So we have general recommendations about that in our first report, but looking more specifically at what that funding formula might include, not obviously at a level of detail, but in terms of the high level priorities that we think are going to be important for OSCE to prioritize and consider. And then similarly, how that plays out in terms of the approach to creating agreements between ECE and childcare facilities to participate in that. So both of those things are going to interact with the conversation around experience. So I wanted to just note that, these things all, they intersect and they influence each other. So we'll do some toggling back and forth, but for some of this, we're going to, hold off a little bit on some of those specifics until we can get into the issues around the funding formula. And then that topic of benefits, which again has come up a lot, and we're going to want to spend some more time on, but we won't be spending time on that tonight. So as a reminder from our last conversation, the idea here is our salary scale as proposed in our initial report contemplates both role and credential, but does not contemplate experience, which is the third factor that we were specifically asked to consider in terms of a salary scale. And so we're going to look at that and talk a little bit further about what we think we want to prioritize. I think it's important to remember that we explicitly in our recommendations have laid out this short-term and long-term frame. And part of the reason for doing that is because we know that there's some information and some processes and systems that are going to need to be gathered and constructed in order to do the long-term. And so some of the things that we are going to be wondering or talking about in terms of the salary scale, we may not know the answers to now, and so we're not going to be able to have super specific or detailed recommendations, but we can say this is something that we think is really important, and we're going to want ECE to consider it and prioritize it as we continue to get more information. So I'm just sort of flagging that I want to, sort of encourage us to not get too hung up on the fact that there's information we don't have right now. That is true, and we want to be thinking in terms of long-term, what might this look like? So that said, this deck tonight draws heavily from the document that you see here, Strategies in Pursuit of Pre-K Teacher Compensation Parity. It's been in our background materials folder, so you may have looked at it in the past, but I just wanted to flag that a lot of tonight's conversation draws from that. And I want to remind everyone that while while what we're doing here is very new, in that we're looking at how parity would look for center-based teachers who are not just teaching pre-K kids, but are teaching infant and toddler, are working with infant and toddlers. There's just not a lot out there on that because people haven't done it yet. As Sarah pointed out at our last meeting, there are some analogies that we can draw from folks who have been thinking about pre-K pay parity. And so that's in part what the sort of focus on this particular report is. So the examples that are in here are around pre-K, and so to the extent that that sort of brings up different things, I just want to acknowledge that. But it does, it is sort of a helpful set of comparisons to be able to draw from. So, and the way that this particular paper lays out these questions, I think, is sort of mirrors how we've approached this conversation overall in terms of thinking about what members of the early childhood workforce. We've answered that first question. The second question, we've been clear that there is an anchor parity with DCPS, although, it looks somewhat different for different credential levels because of the differences between the two. And then, we've started to look at that third question around equivalency. Tonight, we're focusing on the experience piece. And then the last one around the time frame. Again, I just want to flag, we have already identified some sequencing approach that we think makes sense in terms of starting with the direct to educator payments, and then from there going to the, building it into people's salaries as part of program funding. There are other sequencing approaches that that I think we've already noted or started talking about last time, and I think thinking about how experience might be phased in some of those stages is another place where we can consider that. So I realize that's a lot of framing, but that's where this is all coming from. So again, this is from that same document, but it's just a reminder that part of what we continue to wrestle with is when we talk about parity, are we talking about things that are identical, or are we talking about things that sort of in spirit are the same, or the same in essence as the language this uses, which we'll engage with ongoing. And it provides some examples for how some of the different jurisdictions that are in this report deal with those comparisons. So we'll look at some of those examples ongoing. Okay, so with all of that framing, this slide highlights a few of the potential sort of values tensions that we might consider as we think about what is most important to us in terms of incorporating experience as a factor. And so these are not, exhaustive by any step, but by any measure. But if you look at these top two, sort of the concept that we talked a little about last time is, what value do we put on parity to the extent possible with DCPS? So that would mean, for example, mimicking to the degree we could timing and degree of step increases, some of the other ways in which they think about experience. So capping experience at incoming experience at 10 years is just one of the things that DCPS does. So we might decide that kind of alignment to DCPS for various reasons, including that it's a market that we're in, right? So DCPS, has around half of the, early or pre-K classrooms, and so that that might make sense for us to really align with for that reason, and because it's a clear signal and symbol, within our context. At the other end of that spectrum is the idea of autonomy at the provider level. And we talked about this a little bit last time. So to what degree do we value that, having providers have some discretion to pay beyond what a minimum is, or even what a specific level is for experience, to have some discretion, perhaps within bands or guidelines, and those, you don't obviously have to pick entirely one or entirely the other. There's a sort of spectrum there, but that's one kind of dimension that we might think about. And then similarly at the bottom, you have the concept of do you sort of particularly prioritize clarity and predictability, where you would have, for example, standardized increases at regular standardized intervals. So with every year experience, there is a 2.5% increase in salary, or do you want to think about more targeted goals in terms of recruitment and retention? So based on what we know or could learn, we might say, well, what's most important is that early on in an educator's career, working, with in whatever their early educator role is, early on, it's really important to move people up the salary scale, because that's what's going to hold on to them, and that's where we have biggest risks. Or we might say we really want to value longevity and having people who've been there for a really long time to stay. That's really valuable. And if you look at some of the different pay scales, how DCPS approaches it, how some of these others, you see very different approaches in terms of that. So that again gets to some of the sort of priorities or values. What do we think matters, and what are we trying to achieve as we think about experience? So that was a lot of background and framing. I'm going to stop talking, and I want to see what this all has sparked for folks as you have been tracking this. And there are a bunch of, more specific questions and then examples that follow. So we can move there, but I, do want to, oh, yes, Marla.
You said it, but DCPS and other salary scales, like when they stop and hold people for a while or they do certain things, those are the types of techniques that they use to emphasize either longevity or retention. So personally, I just want to make sure, are you asking us which of the 4 buckets we're most in support of right now, or you just want our overall thoughts? I just want to make sure I know the question that you're asking at this particular point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm asking a really open question, which I realize may not be super helpful. But I want to, in sort of thinking about the kinds of approaches that we might recommend that ECE take. And I don't anticipate that we're going to come out of this with, we believe that after 1 year, there should be an exactly 2.4%, that like some of those specific things are probably left better to others. But if there is a particular value that we think is going to be really important to emphasize, and again, that value might be stick as closely as you possibly can to the DCPS pay scale, because we actually think that is a value, for example, or, we want this kind of flexibility, or, we think that what we can really get out of this in terms of how we strengthen the field is, recruiting people at the front end, keeping people in the middle of their career, whatever those things are, so that we can sort of turn that into more overall guidance.
So to that end, I think we should try and stay as close, lockstep and parity with DCPS as possible, with the caveat of the conversation we had last time, which is that providers could pay more but not less. But what ECE will support is the pay scale as pretty much published by DCPS, with, of course, maybe some modifications, but in general, we'll stay lockstep with them. That's my preference.
Thanks, Marla. And FYI, as you all are listening to this, later on in this deck, there are a bunch of examples of how different places approach it, including that DCPS pay scale. So you can actually put your eyes on it and see what that looks like. Yeah, Sally.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I have a favorite right now. I mean, I think, initially when we all went into this, it was, yeah, let's parity with DCPS. That's what birth to 3 law was, pointing towards. I think one of the challenges with that will be the fact that not only, do they look at experience, but there's also that impact evaluation. So if we're talking about a parity salary scale with DCPS, then we have to, as a system, how do we factor in the evaluation? Now, we can say that, yes, programs should be doing individual evaluations, but, with DCPS, it is a standardized evaluation. How do we, if we're having a standardized salary scale, then does that also mean we need to have a standardized evaluation system for programs that are not, that are part of this program? And I'm just raising that as a question for discussion, not, not whether I'm leading one way or the other, but I think that's just, again, as we start thinking about all of these examples, and, when we used to have the small subcommittees and we're talking about all these different ideas, that is one of the things that I think we have to kind of think about, is how do we tie evaluation into this? And I think it should be, but it's just, how do we do it?
Thanks, Sally. Sarah.
That's such a great point, Sally. I want to note, though, that what you said also just illustrates the interconnection between the different questions Abby laid out before, because, and I'm not proposing this, but just to say, if one were to say that there was some expectation around staff evaluation accompanying this, that would then have implications for what you would think about in terms of what providers would need to agree to or commit to or be held accountable for to participate in the funding system. And I think there are also some interconnections between how you think about whether and how experience is baked into this, and how you think about determining funding amounts and real pros and cons and trade-offs in terms of the kind of data that would need to be tracked. Depending on the decisions you make about this, it impacts where the data needs to be tracked and who's responsible for making decisions about it, in ways that really do have implications for how much is living within the provider and how much has to be living within a centralized system. And so I think the trade-offs are more complicated than they may even initially appear because of those overlaps. And I think the more we can be clear about some of those overlaps as we move through this conversation, it will be helpful to not go down a road that we then realize took us to a place that has harmful impacts for either providers or staff, or can't be implemented effectively.
Other thoughts here before, and we can kind of get in a layer deeper. So there'll be more chances to engage, but before I move on.
I just want to say on the issue of evaluation, I support evaluation. I don't know that I think that evaluation means that there must be a standardized evaluation across all providers. I think context is very important to what type of evaluation tool you choose. I think training, the professional development that will naturally have to occur when you implement evaluation tool. And so I want to go back to think of the DCPS as one LEA, not, and that there are 60 odd LEAs and they all use different evaluations. Well, not all use, but they have the right to use different evaluations. So I think we can have an evaluation tool. It doesn't have to be the same. I think when you think about larger centers versus smaller centers, I think when you think about the context, it's really maybe ECE could provide some support around technical assistance and thinking through evaluations and what best fits a particular context. But I don't think we have to be locked into a particular evaluation system.
Thanks, Mala. So I do think this point around sort of keeping in mind whatever route we go or route, ends up happening, what are the accompanying accountability pieces that might follow that, and to what degree would things need to be standardized? So there's the point around, so is there, so for example here, would there be as part of an agreement that if you sign up for this program, in order to get this funding, one, you have to agree to these minimum salaries and to this salary schedule as laid out, to perhaps, and again, I'm not saying where we land on this, but this is as an example, you might, you have to demonstrate that you have an evaluation system. Perhaps it's, it's not, there's not more guidance than that you just have to show that. And then who makes decisions on certain of these things. So if there is a definition of what counts as creditable experience, who comes up with that definition, and what's the mechanism for ensuring that people are being consistent about that across different providers? So those are the kinds of things that, that I want us to sort of keep thinking about, because as we beef up both the, our definition of experience, which we're specifically asked to do, but then also the accountability and oversight mechanisms, that's part of what, we're going to be recommending. These are the kinds of things that I think we're going to need to weigh in on. So I want to just do kind of an overview of the rest of the information that's in here and then figure out where it makes sense to drill down. So what this slide does is it just sort of translates some of the big picture questions in the last slide into some more details that, again, we might or might not think that we need to have a specific recommendation on these, but these are the kinds of things that ultimately a system, whatever it is, would need to consider, whether that's happening centrally or whether that's happening at the provider level. So, and again, these are not exhaustive, but should the system, the experience, system credit years in role or years in the field, for example. And the examples on here just pull from both examples that are in that that document, that report, but then also DCPS, federal government. So for example, in Georgia, this is all in the pre-K program, but you get experience credit only for years as a lead teacher in a pre-K and have to demonstrate that. Should there be a maximum number of creditable years for entry into new jobs? So we talked about DCPS, that their approach is that's 10 years for teachers and it's 8 years for assistants. Obviously you could set those things, it's arbitrary at some level, but it's meaningful in terms of how it plays out in the field. A maximum number of creditable years overall. So again, Georgia maxes out their experience at 20 years. So after that, there are no step increases beyond that. You still could get cost of living increases as as the whole salary scale goes up, but and then consistent or differentiated increases by credential level, by role. So we can look at how DCPS approaches this. But for example, in DCPS, the step increases are different percentages for teachers than they are for assistants. That's what their collective bargaining agreements have come up with. And that might, again, we might say, well, we're just going to mirror that because it's a system that exists locally. In some of these systems, in several of them actually, for whatever reason, the experience increases are only granted to lead teachers, not to assistants. So they decided to prioritize that in terms of how they approach them. And then the point that we talked about a little earlier around, are there particular points in a career where it makes sense to have different levels of increases? So the federal scale, starts out for the first several years, you get a raise each year for experience, and then it changes to every 2 years, and then it changes to every 3 years. And I'm sure there was a lot of discussion as to exactly why it ended up that way, but that's how it is. And this question of who verifies experience. So these are all questions. I wonder if it makes sense to move down to the DCPS example to sort of see, well, how does DCPS answer these things? Given that that's at least one of the, that's the model that the sort of the most obvious parity model. Does that make sense for folks to spend a little bit of time on that, or should we walk through all these examples? What do people think? Rakai gave a thumbs up, I think. All right, let me do that. So this is just a reminder. This is what we've proposed so far. So this is minimum for our different credential levels and roles. But these are all minimum starting salaries. So you all saw this last time. The approach the DCPS takes, that I think would be the sort of relevant things. So the question of how they assess experience, we would need to get more detail. But the basic idea is your year's experience as a certified teacher is sort of generally speaking how they approach it. So that the analogy there would be probably working in that role. I don't know whether you think about whether you'd have to have had a particular credential in that role for a period of time, but that would be something we need to figure out. Teachers can be placed up to a maximum of step 10 upon hire, which is the equivalent of 10 years experience. And the way DCPS approaches it is up through your first 10 years of service. You get that increase each year. and then it moves to 4 years. And then for the last, actually, it's easier to see on here. No, I don't have that one. And what you see in the DCPS scale, and again, I'm just, trying to give these examples to just drive people's thinking, but the approach for the BA level teacher, which is again where we anchored our pay parity. After 1 year, you get a 0.31% increase, then 1.85, it moves up. And then, for the sort of mid-career here, it's in the, 3+% range. And then you get a hold for 4 years and then a bigger bump. And then there are actually steps beyond this for longevity steps in 17 and 18. Whereas for the assistant teacher level, it's also different percentages each year. For some reason, it's not, there's no consistency here, but it's in the sort of general range, and it just goes up to step 10, doesn't go beyond that. So that's, what that would look like. Some of these other examples, in Georgia, the approach is to have different experience. So they call it supplemental compensation for experience. It looks different for like the rate of increase is different based on degree. So this is all teachers. So if it's a teacher who has an AA, then they get a certain percent increase. If it's a teacher that has a BA, they get a different percent increase. That's how they've chosen to do it. And for them, it's every 2 years is when you're eligible for a new bump. So it's a, again, different approach, and after 20 years, it caps out. This is Alabama's, which they'd have a 3% increase for every step. It's the same for everyone, and there's no difference by credential. With the asterisk here that for pre-K classes that are operating within public school systems, they're supposed to mimic the public school system that they're a part of. Again, we are in a somewhat different situation than that. And then, as I mentioned, the federal government, new hires begin at step 1. They can negotiate another step, but the assumption is that you're beginning at step 1 in whatever that role is. And then there are different rules in terms of how often you get a step increase. Every year for the first 3 years, then it's every other year, then it's every 3 years. So each of these things, obviously there are pros and cons. And the DCPS example kind of has a mix of a lot of those. So if we decided that, again, because of we're just wanting to be aligned with that particular market and all of the signals that parity with DCPS brings, then that might be the most important thing. And so figuring out what the impacts of some of the different pieces within that system maybe are less important. We care less about that. So yeah. Oh, and then this is, sorry, I think that's the last one. This is an example of a system that would have much more discretion within bands. And basically what this just does is for BA, this is where a DCPS teacher would be at step 1. This is where a DCPS teacher would be starting at 5 years experience. And this is where a DCPS teacher would be starting at 10 years. But the idea there is that there'd be then discretion within that. So you'd have to meet those minimums, but how much you go beyond that, would be at discretion. And And this just simply applies those same percentage increases at the AA and CDA level, which obviously don't have a specific parity with DCPS. So again, you've got all of this in that document. So so I realized that was a lot. But let me see what that generated. Yeah, Sally, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Sorry, I just raised it. I think one of the big things for me, and it's on this slide, is the verification of experience. I mean, I think that's going to be a big discussion that we have, is how do we verify it? Who verifies it? What counts as experience? You know, in the other states, obviously they're just looking specifically at pre-K, and they're looking at educators who are certified pre-K teachers, and we are looking at, you know, educators who are doing the 0 to 5 spectrum. You know, so what counts as that? Do we? So I think that's going to be a big kind of discussion that we're really going to have to kind of flesh out of, you know, how do we figure that out? And so that was just something that really jumped out at me. And
let me ask you, Sally, and anyone else as well. I think that is a really, really, really important point. And I'm wondering if you have instincts around that. I mean, again, not necessarily about like the super details, but like, how would you approach that?
I mean, right now, the process is somebody submits their resume, and they fill out, you know, the standard application to let, you know, to say how much experience they have, so that you can look at that for your own internal thing of where would I put them, and where would, you know, what salary am I going to hire them at? And I quite honestly, I think that's probably going to be our biggest challenge, is verifying the experience and what that's going to look like. Because again, I almost think that might have to be a centralized thing, similar to the credentialing, you know, where credentials have to be verified, so that it isn't necessarily something that an individual program has to, you know, it's like you can go onto the system. Yes, that person has the CDA, it's current, it's valid. Yes, this person has an AA, it's been verified. The question is, how do we do that? But I think that's probably our biggest sticking point with this.
Thanks, Sally. Michael.
Yeah, I'm also on Team Sally in terms of being very interested, focused, and like trepidatious about delving into the who verifies question, because I do think that is like our biggest one here. I was going to take this opportunity to say I feel like we should like work on the other ones first. Not that I want to work on the other ones right now. I would actually rather dive straight into that, but I wanted to like pause and see if folks had other thoughts on the other ones before we go into that, because I have thoughts about that, but I don't want to start hijacking things before we get to the first 4 things on the list.
I guess I just want to note that this is again a place where there is an issue of interconnection. The more there is a differentiation in funding that is flowing to providers that is tied to staff experience, the more comprehensive the data on that topic that is collected centrally would need to be, and the higher the bar for any kind of external validation of that experience would be, just purely from a, anytime anybody's validating something that they receive money for, that creates kind of red flags from people who audit our programs and things like that. And I'm not saying that from a position of distrust, just from a sort of a good design and what creates, you know, backstops on how public funds are used perspective. And I think the options for go forward verifications of experience are a lot cleaner cut than the options for backwards looking verifications of experience. I think there are a variety of ways you could build that in for the future, that it is very hard to go back and establish clear documentation of things that happened in the past if they weren't documented in certain ways.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I'm understanding partly what you're saying, Sarah, that there's, I mean, part of it is, yes, like the more, you know, the more funding that's involved and the more factors that are involved, there is a public accountability piece that goes along with that, and that makes perfect sense. But the other piece of it that I think I hear you saying is that literally there will need to be more information in order to determine the right levels of funding to go to programs and to create formulas that make sense, right? Because if there's an expectation that you're meeting this additional experience dollars, then it's going to require more information. Is that right?
I mean, I don't want to make assumptions about that because that relates to the how is funding determined question that we haven't talked about. And you could imagine going down a road where you get so detailed in some of these things that it really isn't feasible for programs or for, implementation of a program. But I think these are the kinds of connections that it's important to think about, in the context of these conversations.
Thank you. And thank you, Sally, I see that note in there around, it's maybe another one of the approaches to phasing that we could think about, which is the short-term experience validation and then long-term, which allows us to look forward, which is just easier because once people are there, then it's easier to measure.
Yeah, and I think it's part of that infrastructure building because we don't have a system built yet. So we may have to, just say, okay, well, whatever it is, short term will go X amount of experience or just whatever, something very simple, sort of like we're doing in this short term funding for FY22 versus once a system is built where it can then be, fair, like Sarah was mentioning, there's ways to, build it long term of verifying experience. But so that just again is something that popped into my head that we may have to do kind of different steps.
Yeah.
I'm with
Cassie,
Michael. I'm sorry.
I just wanted, Cassie, I think you had your hand up before.
Yeah, that was actually I did, and then Sarah kind of brought up the point that I wanted to make about would this be experience? Would we count experience that from previous roles or years in the field, or would it go forward? So I think that's just up for debate, but that was my question.
Got it. Marla and then Kelly.
I think it's prudent for us to answer the other questions first and kind of create our ideal scenario. And then after we figure out, then we have to come to the question of verification, and then we'll have to figure out any concessions are needed to be made considering our current state. But I think if we could start with what we truly want, and then we can maybe have to make some concessions. But I think if we start with verification first, we are going to start off with a position of concession or immediate.
Yeah, fair point to start with our aspiration. Kelly and then Rakaya.
Hi, I'm sorry. My volume is not working. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I just wanted a little more clarity. And I'm sorry, I'm an example person. So let's just say I have 10 years experience. And that's what you mean. Like if I come into your center, I'm coming on an interview, I have 10 years experience, but no CDA or AA, you're trying to figure out where I fit in the pay scale. Is this correct in my assumption?
So I think the way we're thinking about it, Kelly, is that it is the interaction of these three factors. So the role that you're coming into, so teacher or assistant teacher, the credential that you have. So are you coming in with CDA, AA, BA, or less than a CDA? And then what's your experience level? And that those three factors all combine. So I don't think we're suggesting that experience would trump the credential, but it would be in combination with the credential. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes, I understand that a lot better. Just, I mean, of course, I'm older in the game of childcare, and so I recently got paperwork. I never let my my CDA lapse even when I received my AA. But I did get my, I was lead teacher before I had anything, not my CDA, but maybe my CDA. And that was part of the role. We're gonna bump you up to lead teacher. You have 10 years experience. I see that you could do it. You need to get your CDA, and then we can bump you up to this after you get this position. So I just was trying to figure it out, because I do agree that sometimes having paperwork, which is important, sometimes for me just doesn't trump experience. Because if you're brand new from college and you don't have the experience, somebody, just an assistant teacher, could have just better management and skill than you.
Yeah, I think that you're raising a really important question, Kelly. And again, this is where the analogy to the pre-K examples just doesn't work that well. So the point around what you're crediting, are you crediting experience that may have come? So if you were in a lead teacher role, but you didn't have, you didn't have X degree, and you may have been teaching in a place where you didn't need it, right? You might not have needed the CDA in, whatever jurisdiction you were in. You were in that lead teacher role for X number of years. I do think that would be one of the questions around how do you credit experience in that situation if you're now trying to figure out where somebody falls in the matrix when they do have X degree. Like, are you counting all those years experience? Are you only counting the years experience at a certain degree level? I think that's the kind of tricky question that we need to think about. Marla.
I don't have anything. I'm sorry. Let me lower.
I had my hand up and I took it down because I think most of what I wanted to say was said, but I think my question, I guess my only thing that I wanted to raise and flag is, I feel like when we were doing the short-term program, we left some of the meatier, harder questions to the end, which I think made sense because it gave us the chance to knock some things out. And I think that would probably be good for setting momentum. But the only thing I just wanted to raise is it would be helpful to make sure that we reserve some time to make sure that we're able to dig in on the hard questions, so that I guess I feel like the benefits cliffs piece, I wish we had been able to spend a little bit more time on that when we did the short term. And so when we're talking about this really complicated piece, like experience and validating experience, I think it makes sense for us to skip over it, like some others have suggested for now, but just holding that space so that we can dig in a little bit. I just worry about that piece.
Got it. And so, Rakai, I'm sorry, are you talking about things with respect to experience, or are you just saying we should move off experience and get to other stuff?
Yeah, I think folks were proposing the verification of experience and that just ball of questions within the experience piece, within just the verification of experience piece. That might be a quick decision that we make once we've talked through all the rest of them, but I just want to make sure that if it requires more time, that we're prepared to do that.
I see. So let me throw back the question then, because we heard from at least a couple of folks, maybe it was just a couple, that there's still an instinct around really framing this in terms of parity with DCPS to the extent that we can. So again, there are going to be certain things that we're going to have to go outside of that, because the ways for not everything is analogous, but to the extent that we can, to have the experience scale look like DCPS's experience scale. So having now gotten into some of these details, I just want to circle back to that. Is that something that feels right to the group, to the individuals who brought it up? Is that where you still are, or where other people? I want to just sort of do a little temperature check on that.
I mean, I guess I would say, like, I haven't heard a compelling reason for this specific part to not try and mirror it with DCPS, like at least using that as a starting point. We saw a couple different examples, and I'm assuming that those much closer to the day-to-day operations of delivering childcare and so on, like if something was glaring about it, we would have raised it. So I from my perspective, it's more of I haven't heard a DD, like here's the reason why we should not. And so I'm inclined to at least use the DCPS example as like the starting point.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think it just adds, like for me, it seems like there's one additional step that doesn't need to be there. There's 4 steps in that, or 4 like phases. And it's like 1 year, every year of service, and then every 4 year, then after 4 years, you get an increase. And then randomly you have like 1 year and then 2 years for the rest of the schedule. It just feels like that 1 year didn't need to be there. But that's the only thing that feels a little extraneous to me. Otherwise, I don't really feel very strongly about this versus any of the other examples we saw.
Michael.
It's possible I missed this and it was like explained better, so apologies, but I feel like the DCPS thing was sort of phrased as like there are 2 parallel tracks, and one's for assistants and one's for teachers. And I think like obviously the goal here is to get progression within the profession. And so I guess like this goes somewhat to the role in field question that you're starting with though, but is there an equivalent DCPS version of that? Like if you have 8 years as an assistant, how does that factor into the DCPS scale, or is that something we need to make up on our own if we're going to try and model off that?
So wait, you're saying if you
like, I think you're saying like moving from the bottom track on slide 14 into the top one, right? So like it's progress, like yeah. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah, like
yeah, they're parallel on the slides, and I assume in real life there's got to be some way to go between the two, because
so that's interesting. Yes, okay, so that's a great kind of case use case, whatever the right order of those words is. So I think in DCPS, if you had been an assistant, and then you got your degree and your teaching credential, I think you would start at step 1. Although I'm not sure of that, so I can certainly find out. And again, we can find out all of these analogies to the extent that we want to try and match them up. It is I think that the assumptions about progression are somewhat different, I think. And the scales are built that way. Doesn't mean that doesn't happen sometimes, that someone doesn't move from an assistant role and then become a teacher. It certainly happens. But I actually think that's not how the salary scales are built.
Abigail, can I say something about
yeah.
that? So if you look at this scale, yeah, you do, for the most part, you will start at step 1 without some exception. But if you look at step 10 and then you look at step 1, generally what I've seen in various districts is that if you move between roles, they rarely make you lose money. And since step 10 makes significantly less than step 1, they're saying that the incentive is from you moving from assistant to, in this case, we would use the term lead, is such the big jump in salary. And so you would not change in step. Now, in some cases, you'll see this happen between teachers when they go into the administrative role, because a high earning teacher or a teacher with multiple years could conceivably make more than a first year administrator. And so that's where most districts will say, we're not going to have you less than what, or make less than what you made, and they'll bring you in at that step. But because the gap is so wide here, almost 25,000, you would never really run into that issue. And so I would imagine, I'm so sorry, that you would start at step one. So that's what the incentive there. The incentive to become a lead teacher is not that you would get on the same requisite, step you were before, but it would be that once you went to the teacher scale, you would make significantly more.
Yeah. Now keep in mind, so that is super helpful. And again, some of this is like blowing these all out and then looking at some of those scenarios. Keep in mind that what you see on this slide, this is actually the current scale for assistant teachers in DCPS, which starts lower than what we have proposed. So we have our, there's going to be a little bit more in the way of overlap because of the way that we have proposed a salary scale that includes multiple credential levels, which DCPS's does not. And we made a decision that we thought it made sense to include the credential level beyond the requirement at that one level above. So but one of the things this is making me think is that it will be that it would be useful to map this out at using these same percent increases as the sort of parity model to map out all of those all the way through, and then look at it all lined up and see basically where some of those challenges, that some of those mismatches might actually show up, where there need to be decisions made. Does that make sense? What I just
It did, but can you go back to that slide? Because I think that slide is instructive. So the way I would read this, let's say that you were an assistant teacher and you had an AA, you were making 48,000, and then you become a lead teacher. I think if you have an AA, then you would go to 56,000, right? I mean, so you would not necessarily go up in step, but you would go up in salary. And we would need to see if there are any places where that doesn't hold true.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. That's super helpful. Mm-hmm. Sally.
Yeah, Abigail, you actually took my point, because I'd made a note on the slides here that I actually wanted us to go to look at this, our proposed minimum salary scale, and then build from that. So looking at what are the percent increases on the DCPS scale and how does that look? So, could we have the visual at least even to like a step 10 of, what does that look like? Because then that's going to pull in that experience question of how do we fit folks in? What does, so just all of the gazillion questions that are going to come up around experience. But I think I like starting with our salary scale and building it out to, to sort of mimic the DCPS in terms of percent increases between steps, and then kind of having that visual to figure out what we need to change or strengthen or keep, or, and then how does experience play into that? Because again, we are a different system, so to speak, than DCPS, but I think DCPS gives us a sort of an example to follow, but this I think fits more of what is our reality.
Yep. All right, so that feels like a right next step. The other the other element, I'm sort of hesitating to bring this up because it's just adds potentially confusion, but again, for DCPS, because they only have one level for teacher assistant, they don't have the multiple credential levels. It's just not how they built their salary scale. Using these percent increases, you know, like that's the only analogy we have. So we could just apply those to all three of our levels here. On the teacher side, the BA level obviously is 1-to-1. And so using these percentage increases would be the sort of clearest example of parity.
DCPS has master's level.
It has BA plus, it has masters, and it has,
so it has,
and each of those actually the percentage increases look different. So
they're not consistent, right? Okay.
So we could just say we're just gonna stick with the BA for all the BA percent increases for all three credential levels in our system, or we could, you know, say, well, BA is the base, is the lowest one for DCPS teachers, and so we'll put that as the percent increases for the CDA teachers, for example, and then BA plus for the it will be what we use for the AAs and master. You know what I'm saying? Like if we're I don't want to get, I realize I'm getting into the weeds, but these are all the like parity questions that come up. So I just want to flag that on people's thoughts. Taryn.
That's interesting. Do we know why there are different percentages, or and do they follow a pattern? Like, are the higher salaries the ones with the lower annual increases, or no?
So these are collectively bargained, remember? So the differences are based on what the union bargained for. There's a large body of evidence nationally showing that collectively bargained teachers' agreement, collective bargaining levels tend to prioritize the higher degrees and backload the compensation increases for reasons that may not be entirely evidence-based and may have more to do with the internal incentive of a teachers union. I don't want to speak for anything in the DCPS context, but there is some evidence and research on that nationally.
Yeah,
and that kind of argues for having a set, you know, just it's kind of an equitable frame to having a set percentage increase. This one, I'm not saying I could be convinced otherwise. It just seems like that having a set increase might be good.
So yeah, I mean, one potential kind of middle ground to what you're saying, Taryn, is, which is sort of, well, is to say, all right, overall between step 1 and step 10 or 15 or whatever, this is the overall increase. And you just smooth that across. So you still use that as you're pegging it to the DCPS, you know, lowest number and highest number, and then you're just dividing it evenly across, for example. So that would be a way, that would be a departure from the detail of DCPS's scale, but would perhaps be in spirit parity. And again, we could do, like, it's easy enough to do both of the versions we just described, you know, to do like exactly if you apply those percentages and then just do a smoothed out percentage and just see what the two things look like. So, and you know, for explanation purposes, a smoother one might be easier, but it's not, you know, wouldn't be exactly mirroring DCPS.
I was just gonna say, I mean, optically, it certainly does seem like saw the Alabama example, and this is one that caught my like a flat 3%. Optically, it seems more easily digestible that you have sort of a consistent step. And hearing the explanation from Sarah as to how they landed on these different percentages just through a bargaining agreement, it is what it. I mean, that is what happened. But I don't know. I think let's see how the numbers shake out. If you were to do, Abigail, as you described, the endpoints and then just smooth it through. But to me, it would seem like that just logically it makes sense. Like I can see it's consistent versus seeing the random pattern. It sort of just makes you want to say, like, why are we doing it that way?
Yeah. And yeah, to Sally's point in the chat, there will be they're negotiating another contract right now. So this will be which will look a little different than this one. Yeah.
But Abigail, where I was talking about parity, I was talking about parity at the BA level for DCPS and the BA level for us. And then to me, because in DCPS, you can't be a lead teacher of Essence without a BA, I think we should standardize like with a 3%, I mean, considering it doesn't overlap in some kind of way, because I don't understand the kind of move. I mean, I do understand why they did that. I just don't necessarily agree with the movement of, sometimes it's a 1.5. Oh, I'm so sorry. And then sometimes, a 3 or over 3%, and then sometimes it's a 6%, so I was talking about that being the place of parity, and then we make rational decisions from there that best fit our context.
Okay.
Because otherwise there's that's the only real true point of comparison. A person with a BA in DCPS and a person with a BA in ECE Center. Every place else, we need to be thinking about what best makes sense for the models in which our community is situated.
Yep. This is super. I feel like this is helping us to sort of move forward to some at least potential models here. I want to see if people have any additional thoughts on two issues that have come up relative to some of these questions. One being around the who verifies experience, and just would love to hear people's thoughts about what should be considered there, because I do think that will end up being a tricky question, and having guidance on that. And then the second thing is around this question of evaluation that Sally threw out, and whether that's something that this group thinks they would recommend be a part of an expectation for participation. So, if you participate, you got to pay the salaries and you got to have some evaluation system. Is that something that is of interest to people to be explicit in what might that look like? So those are the two questions: evaluation and verification of experience. Michael.
Yeah, I guess I am fairly agnostic about the evaluation part because I don't know a whole lot about how best to do that. So I will defer to others on that, at least for now. I think the verification thing gives me like all kinds of heebie-jeebies when we start talking about verifying roles and fields by like at the center level. I think you can like just create some really bad incentives for centers to make it hard for people to get credit for the work they've been doing if we're not doing some kind of centralized way of doing this. And I feel like that's, that is both a bad thing in terms of, power over the employee and just general professional development. I think it was Sally that made the point in the chat earlier that it would like the short-term, long-term thing, I think makes a lot of sense here. And it's every minute we put into that is worth it because it's not just going to be the upfront, like how we implement this in the first few waves. It's going to be probably the model we use for how we bring in teachers with experience outside of our verification and credentialing system. So I think like having a shorter term and a longer term approach makes sense for that reason. And I think, my preference is at the longer term, we make Sarah's job harder and have Aussie do a lot of work to centralize some of this verification, just because I think, it's worth it to, this is already a market that doesn't work particularly well for employees. And I think it's worth building an infrastructure that, can make our educators more mobile if they need to be, or, make sure they're getting fair compensation for their work. And then my only other flag on this is going back to the just the two parallel tracks DCPS example. I do think this verification infrastructure plays into whether we need to be thinking about credit for experience in roles or just credit for experience overall. So you can imagine if I am in a situation where I have 10 years experience and I'm a lead teacher, and our system is giving us credit for credentials and my current role, but not my experience in that role, I would make a lot more money if I left my current facility and went somewhere else where they were operating off of a different system. And I realize the goal is to get a pay scale where that problem goes away, but I think it's going to be really hard to solve that problem unless you build all the record keeping infrastructure at a central repository.
Other thoughts on those particular questions? Yeah, Marla.
I have no idea how you could verify experience reliably. So I that boggles my mind, because in the K-12 context, most of the time you're talking about systems that generally are going to be around, and then when they're if they go quote unquote out of business, they have to send a whole cache of documents to somewhere so that those documents are stored, everything from student transcripts to everything. So I don't know how we can do that. I do think we have to build a system going forward that would be central in order to make this work. In terms of evaluation, again, I do think that there should be an evaluation tool, but I do not think that it should be prescriptive and or named. It could be descriptive because context matters when choosing a tool.
Thanks. So Marla, you're talking about something like, you think there should be an expectation that there be an evaluation process system, and that perhaps there would be certain standards described, like that, an evaluation system that takes into account blah, but that beyond that, you would not require anything specific. Is that right? Merkaya.
In thinking about verifying experience, two initial things come to mind for me. And one is, I guess what I'll say maybe broadly and step back is, I think generally a centralized approach makes sense. But where I start to, there's a lot of things that give me question marks, but the first two that come up are, number one, the field of early education is changing so much right now. And, even in DC, we have, we're seeing folks understanding early education very differently. And so in terms of DC has two roles, and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, within licensing, the lead teacher and the assistant teacher, that may be conceived of differently in other places. And that, so in validating experience, comparing role for someone who maybe comes from outside of DC may be challenging. It would be something we would have to consider. I think the second thing that comes up for me is turnaround time. And I know that, it can take a little bit of time to go through a process that, especially at a government agency. And when I think of, the experience that a provider and a teacher might have during the hiring process, I think something to consider, which is not necessarily a barrier, but are some of the speed bumps that come up for me in the, yes, Sarah, the verification process is the turnaround time and how we can keep folks, get folks through the process in a fairly expedient way so that they can start their job and get their training going. So those would be two of the things that come to mind. I think there's a lot of other things that I don't have a good way to articulate yet, but I think centralized makes sense is the short of it.
I think for the out of town piece, you can, I know with certification, when you're looking, because if you're certified in one state doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be certified in another. And so when you start to look and think, okay, I'm considering leaving where I am, you could always have that stuff. You could have a evaluation of your credentials done in advance. And I think once we get the system up and rolling, if you are coming from another state or something, you could in advance say, okay, this is what I have. And then they could say, yes, this is what you would be verified as. And so that when you actually go to interview, you would already have that kind of in hand. So that would not delay you.
So I'm hearing some overall support around the concept of a centralized verification system, understanding that it might take some time to make that happen. I want to give Sarah a chance to weigh in on, there's obviously all kinds of logistical challenges that we can imagine, but conceptually, do you think this, what's your reaction to this? And then practically, what does this make you think?
So I think conceptually, with enough time and resources, many things are possible. I hesitate to talk more about details without, consulting with our IT people, because a lot of this is about IT data systems ultimately and how they work and how they work with other systems. I will say, many things are possible, but they have costs, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of time and what's asked of providers and programs in terms of, how they're tracking their information, where they're putting that information, what's asked of individual educators. Some of those things may be things the task force decides are completely reasonable things to ask as a condition of what we, I think, all share an aspiration to be really significant compensation benefits for the workforce and ultimately sustainability and quality benefits for our facilities. But some of them, people may decide the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And I think that's the piece we want to really think about. Like, we all want perfect data in the abstract, but how you line up to have that data in a way that you have trust in actually does require asking things of people and programs that vary in the complexity and the level of difficulty to provide.
Yeah, appreciate that point. So as part of our balance, and we talked in our first report around, balancing the demands on everybody in terms of administrative burden, and so the sort of question of, in this particular case, is the juice worth the squeeze? What would it entail? That seems like an important point for us to weigh. Sally.
So speaking from a person who runs a program, I honestly would have no issue in terms of entering information, verifying information. But this goes back to what Sarah said, working with an IT to get a system that doesn't ask a program to enter duplicative information 50 different times, which is unfortunately what we're doing now, which is, Sarah, where you hear the frustration from program directors of like, but I've already given you this information here. You're asking it for me to do it again here. I'm having to do it again here. If it's, if we can streamline a system, that will go a long way to getting buy-in from programs who would be willing to do this. I mean, programs, big discussion on the Directors Exchange today is where are we finding folks to come work for us? And, part of it is salary, part of it is the challenge of COVID right now. But, if there is this glimpse of what can be, you will have people who are very willing to be a part of it if we can get the system right. So I think that is going to be key to it, is getting the system right where we're not having to enter, the information 20 different times. Like I said, I'll be first in line for the program.
And I think the thing I will say on this is, and there's a great conversation between Michael and Dr. Dean going on in the chat, but if you build a system exactly the way you need it to function from the beginning and everybody's agreed on everything, then you can avoid some of those things. I think, the district is doing this, like we are on the bleeding edge here. And so we're trying to do things that haven't been done before. And so it is likely that anything we do will require some degree of iteration over time. And it is when you get into iteration that it becomes more challenging in terms, having information in ways that you may not have originally planned for it. So I think, thinking through like that balance of how do we get clear on some things up front can help inform thinking about how we would build things, but also it is likely that anything we do will have to change some over time as well. And I think just setting expectations for that.
Yeah. I think that this is a helpful conversation. And I think, again, we've talked in the past about the reliance of all that we're talking about on data systems. And ECE is already, deep into updating some of its existing systems that would be required for this. But there's new functionality that we're talking about that, that has not been imagined and then needs to be built into a system, which is a process. So I think actually this all is sort of a good segue into this question around sequencing. And so we talked about this some in our last conversation, and we've built on it a fair bit in this conversation. But so I'm now looking at this. I'm not sure exactly how relevant everything on the slide is going to be because it was created before this meeting. But we talked about the importance of gathering some baseline data for the work for all the work that would happen in the sort of phase 2 beyond the direct to educator, and that we can leverage, in fact, the first phase to some degree to collect some of that, some of those data, but that we're going to have to be really smart about what data is most important to inform and support the long-term mechanism, and what are the ways to get that are not going to create the kind of administrative burden that is going to frustrate providers. So there's obviously no specific time frame on any of these, but the idea of baseline data, then going forward with launching when the basic long-term mechanism is ready, where we can have agreements between ECE and providers, starting with the salary minimums. And we had talked about that before, but it seems like that's something that we should at least put out there as a potential sequencing, which could at the same time that we could have the full experience salary scale laid out, that this is where we want to end up. This is the goal, and it could be out there for everybody, so that to the extent that some individual providers are able to start meeting it, great, but that having an expectation around that until we have a first kind of round of implementation is probably going to be challenging, maybe not possible. So to then use the baseline year of implementation to first of all just do some cost assessment. One of our question marks is how much is this all going to cost, and are we going to have enough funding in what is already laid out in the pay equity fund? And we don't have a hard answer to that, but that's going to be really important, because one of the questions will then be, we could have all the beautiful systems built, but if there's not enough money to effectively fund this, then the council and the mayor need to figure out if there's more funding to be had. And the advocacy community, I know, will be right there ready to push for it. But until that's defined, we just can't know the degree to which we could do the full rollout. So does this feel like the right way to be thinking about this broadly, understanding that obviously there need to be more specific timeframes put up against this as we got more information? I mean, does this reflect what we've been talking about?
I guess, Abby, one thing I will also say to the prior point and sort of the question you asked and Sally's comments on it is, I'm also cognizant that about the number of new things that would be rolled out and questions that would be asked at the same time, in terms of, if you're trying to, have people implement new salaries and go through a new experience to validate experience. And, there was a prior conversation today about evaluation systems. Those are a lot of changes to ask people to do at once. And we are already at a time when people have had to deal with a very large amount of change in a way that is like quite emotionally overloading in some cases, and capacity overloading. And I think it's important to be mindful of that. And like, this is a marathon, not a sprint, because where we want to go long-term is a long-term piece. And I think it may be helpful to keep that in mind as we think about what is sustainable for the people who are in the system living through the change.
Yeah, for sure. Other thoughts on this? I see your comment in the chat, Rakai, about chunking it by fiscal year, which certainly could be a kind of easy way to lay it out. And I feel like what I've heard sort of ongoing in our conversations, but I want to see if I'm hearing right, is that there's some value in the same way that we've put out a proposed salary scale, knowing that it's going to be some period of time before that could be implemented, that having visibility into what things might look like long-term, or where we're headed towards, is useful, even if we're really clear that there's going to need to be sequencing, and doing this the right way is important. And so that's going to mean, building data systems and gathering data and taking the time that we need to do that well without overwhelming people. So both those things can be true at the same time, that we can sort of lay out so people can see this is where we're headed. This is, this is the goal. But that we're being clear that that's not going to happen immediately, as just a sort of basic communication.
I'll just second that. The sort of long-term piece on the data side is I think a really useful perspective, both because it's going to take a while to get stuff, and it prevents the kind of like short-term, let's hire somebody, get this thing built, and not necessarily own the data or the software that's going to make it really expensive to fix this right in the long term. So yeah, I think that's really useful in terms of, making sure everybody involved who may not have experienced that kind of hold-up problem before knows what we're dealing with, and why it's why we might take longer to make a better system, even if it is slower to roll out all the pieces.
Okay. And then this next piece, I know there's a lot of text on the slide, but this just again pulls straight from that strategies in pursuit of pre-K teacher compensation parity, is just a reminder on the data piece. And I think, we've talked about this in terms of there's certain data that we need to be able to plan effectively, which is absolutely right. And we can't ask everybody for everything at the same time, and we're not even in a position to do that. So, there's got to be a sequencing for that purpose. But the other thing that the authors of this note that I think is just important for us to remember is we also want to be able to see what is the impact of this whole thing over time. And so in order to do that, that requires, again, some baseline data. And then being able to see over time, how is this? I mean, our goal here is, yes, to pay our educators more because they're worth it, and to have a strong and stable landscape of early learning, right? So we want to be able to see that is what happens over time, that it's helping with retention, that it's helping with recruitment, that we're able to to actually fill positions and all of those kinds of things. And that takes, that is measuring that kind of progress and impact is significant. I mean, I know we've got a couple of researchers on in this group, and that is not a small feat, and it's not something that that OSCE can just wave a magic wand and presto, we see what the impacts of all these have been. So so I want to just sort of note the importance of really thoughtful, planned out data collection over time. And to Sally's point, that is going to be that's going to all go down much smoother if OSCE is able to spend the time to build the data systems that mean that you don't have to enter things 14 times. I think of every year when I re-enroll my child at school, at the same school, right? It's like, I have to do it all over again. So we've all had that experience. The data, they have here a sort of set of suggested, data that people might think about. Some of it is a little bit less relevant to us. I mean, I suppose the geographical identifiers for regional differences could be interesting, but that may be a bridge too far, for example. But most of the things that are on here are things that we've already talked about, that are going to be important for us to gather information on. And I think being clear on what the purpose of that is, so that everybody knows when they're providing it, that it is, it is going to be in support of these longer term aims, will be helpful. Yeah, Ward in terms of geography, I think that's a great point. So any and on this point, at the point at the very bottom here, ideally information would be collected before any new policies have been implemented to set a baseline. So again, that is an ideal, and in some cases that may seem feasible, and in some cases we're going to be underway before we can collect certain data, and we'll do the best we can with what we've got. But I think I guess I just want to highlight this as both an important need that I think we've already talked about and we've been providing some recommendations around along the way, but also that it's a heavy lift on a whole bunch of people, and that considering the balance in terms of the administrative burden is just something that's really important. Taryn.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think other considerations to consider are how often data are collected, how frequently. Is this annual? Is this every time somebody is hired? Presumably they're going to have to verify experience, right? And so does that trigger a data collection? At what level? And then also, if once experience is taken into account, even if it's experience in the current role, that individual should be able to be tracked across programs. And so there's this individual identifier component as well. So the temporal aspects of the data are another complicating factor.
Any other thoughts or reactions on the data front? Okay. So let me run through where I think we've landed on some of this and some next steps, and then see if anyone has other things they want to add. So in terms of the overall approach on how we add the experience factor into the salary scale, we're gonna come up with a couple of different sort of blown out models to look at that are based that are tied to DCPS in terms of so one that is as close as possible to the DCPS scale using the step increases that they have, like basically mimic as closely as possible for both teacher and assistant teacher what those scales look like, and then another version that would link to those overall increases but smooth it over the steps, and just see what those look like, and to give people a chance to react to that. That we're clear that we want to lay out this aspirational, this is what we want to see, and this is what we think we can get to, and know that there's going to be sequencing requirements, that particularly around data, we need to think carefully about how we can move forward sort of as expeditiously as possible on collecting data that's really going to help inform the process, while taking into account the administrative burden on folks, and aligning that with OSCE's general timelines in terms of data systems, so that we're not duplicating efforts. So that's a second thing. And then that our general thinking is that some kind of centralized verification process for experience is going to make sense, but again, timing of that is more open. And I feel like there was a fourth thing that and that on evaluation there is I think what I heard is a general support of noting the importance of evaluation as part of any sort of talent management system in at the provider level, but that we would not recommend like specific tool or or sort of specific approach. So I think that's what I'm getting out of this. I think that our next, as we move to looking at what the funding mechanism looks like more specifically, that will also, that will help either shore up some of these things or raise, or raise some questions that we'll need to resolve. But obviously those things sort of fit together. So moving to that conversation in our coming meetings is going to be helpful. I feel like there's one other thing. I can't think what it is. So first, is there anything else that came out of this conversation that folks want to make sure is recorded as kind of where we landed, or where you think there's an open question that we need to return to? All right. So, one other thing that I wanted to mention that a few people have asked about is for the report that we submitted on Friday, Sarah is graciously taking the lead on getting that translated, so that it is obviously a long and detailed report, and so it will take a minute. But when that is ready, we will make sure we get that out. And we heard from a couple of folks today who are eager to get a Spanish language version. So so we will certainly let everyone know when that is ready. We've got 3 more meetings that are set up right now for the task force, and we'll work to move through our focus topics. Hopefully we can do it across those next 3 meetings. I'm, the optimist. We may need to add a couple more, but we do have until April 15th to submit our report, but we really want to do it sooner if we can, because we're, for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is you all need to move on. And we'll get an update probably at our next meeting around scheduling around this council hearing that we mentioned last time. So that will be another chance for stakeholders to weigh in on everything that was laid out in our initial report, and then to frame any questions that we're wrestling with in this next round that we would like to hear from folks about, in the same way that we did with the last roundtable, which I think was really, really helpful for us to hear. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Rakaya.
A question, and I'm sorry if I didn't hear it before. Do we have have you all shared a timeline for us in terms of moving this through like moving the recommendations into legislation and through that process?
Yeah, no, we shared that a little bit last time, but Raleigh, do you want to just give a little review of that?
Sure, thanks. So with respect to the short-term recommendation, that's what Abby has. Oh, no, wait, it's not on here. It was on the last meeting. So what we're doing is basically we're writing an emergency to allow OSCE to release those funds to hire the vendor to do the direct payments in accordance with the task force recommendations with that January 15th report. And with respect to the long-term report, that is technically due April 15th, but again, hopefully will be done much sooner, preferably before the budget season. That will give the executive time to review both the short-term and long-term recommendations from this task force to hopefully, fingers crossed, put that into the mayor's budget going forward. And so once the budget is released to us, then it will be embedded in the FY23 funds. That is the plan. Of course, nothing goes according to plan since, I work at the council, but we're prepared for, anything that comes, but we're definitely trying to get the funds out as quickly as possible with respect to short-term for FY22 funds. Does that answer your question, Rakaya? I'm not sure if I...
Thanks. The only thing that I was wondering is or in addition to what you said, is the timeline for the short-term emergency legislation.
Got it.
I don't know if you said it, so that the goal there is for February 1st. Is that right?
Yes. I basically answered everything except for the date, didn't I? Apologies. We're aiming for February 1st introduction at the next legislative meeting.
Thanks, Raleigh.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions or updates?
I have a quick question. In the backgrounds folder, are the PowerPoints in there for us to?
The PowerPoints are in the meeting materials folder. They're 2 different folders. I'll resend out those links.
Please, because I can find the backgrounds one, but I can't find the meeting.
You know what? I can put it in the chat right now, and then that way everybody can have it. And I will say these folders are starting to look a little bit crazy because they have a lot of things and they're not like super organized, but that's okay. All right. Here is the meeting materials folder. And I also will, and probably Sarah's the only one who's really going to care about these, but I've been coming across all of these, like, you know, budget manuals and like crediting experience, all the stuff for the pre-K related programs. So like, I don't know, I've spent way too much time on Georgia and Alabama and New Jersey's early ed websites, but I'm happy to dump all those things on you if they're useful at some point. I can also put them in the background materials folder, but they just may be even more in the weeds. All right. So we're all going to get 11 minutes of our lives back. And, thank you so much for your engagement. Please shoot emails, thoughts as things come to you after this meeting. And I will see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.